So welcome to this month's Evidence of Greatness. And this month I'm talking about an article called A Bio-Informational Theory of Emotional Imagery. And this article was written by Peter Lang. And the first thing that you might recognize or notice is that this is a fairly old article. It came from 1979. And the reason that I'm going back is because this is one of the original articles about bioinformational theory. And you might remember last month, I talked about the first of four theories, and this is the second. So bioinformational theory being the second theory, and we're going to connect bioinformational theory to solution-focused brief therapy. And so I thought it would be really important for me to go back to kind of some of the original work of Peter Lang and to talk about some of the things that he mentioned. I want to begin by talking about what he called the Psychophysiological Studies of Imagery. And what this kind of big, massive word really means is there's a connection between psychology and physiology. Whatever's happening in our psyche, our brain, our emotions, those kinds of things, it's going to impact our bodies. Today, we might really be thinking about this as the mind-body connection. And so we're going to be thinking about the mind-body connection, but in the specific arena of imagery. So holding images in our brain or imagining things happening. And he goes in the literature review, he kind of goes back and he talks about 5 different studies, all the way back to Shaw in 1940, but then kind of moves forward in time to Deckett in 64 and Brady and Levitt in 66 and Brown in 68. And then Wirtz and Lang, and leading then back up to this study that takes place in 1979. And one of the things that each of these studies kind of demonstrated in different ways is that sense organs, when we have an image or we're imagining something in our brain, then our sense organs, things like sight, sounds, nose, so nose, ears, mouth, right? Those kinds of things. When we have images in our brains, there are sense or organ changes. So my eyes shift in certain directions, or my ears perk up, or I start to salivate, or those kinds of things. But also one of the things that these 5 studies kind of demonstrated is that there are also muscle adjustments. So my body physically moves as a response to the things that are going on in my brain. One of the things that these 5 studies also demonstrated is that there was an original perception. So something happens, say someone throws a ball at me, right? I might have the physiological reaction where I try to catch the ball, right? So you can see that my arms move and my muscles tense and I prepare to kind of catch this ball. Another kind of physiological response that I could have, especially if I'm not prepared for the ball coming my direction, is to kind of twitch, right? And again, those muscles, my shoulders go up, I tense up, my head goes down. Maybe I hear the sound of the ball go by my head, right? And so whether that's an original perception like that, or I imagine that perception. I imagine a ball coming toward me and catching it, right? One of the things that these 5 studies demonstrated is that when I imagine it happening, similar things happen, that my eyes widen or focus in on a particular spot. My muscles will tense in a similar way as if I were actually going to catch the ball. And so basically what these studies demonstrated is that the physiological response is similar, whether it's the original perception or if it's the imagined perception. Now, that third bullet down, it talks about how responses in the imagination, they were degraded in specificity. So when a ball is literally coming at me, and again, let's say I'm not prepared to catch the ball, then the reaction is going to be very big and noticeable, right? My head's going to go down quite a bit. My shoulders are going to come up quite a bit. And when it's an imagined perception, I'm not going to have that strong of a reaction, but I might, right? I might do something that mimics that original perception. So although it may not be exactly replicatable, it is similar enough that we can say they are connected to one another. And then that last bullet point there, it says the imagined replication was greatest among those who reported themselves to be good imaginers or who appeared to be so on questionnaires. So we all kind of fall along a continuum of people who hold images well in their head or have vivid imaginations, all the way down to people who do not have very vivid imaginations. And I actually just learned recently that there are about 10% of people who really don't hold images in their head at all. And so we can kind of fall along that continuum. And one of the things that they talked about is the sense organ changes and the muscle adjustments. Those things happened the most in people who held kind of vivid imaginations. And so we may not see the same performance across everyone. There will be kind of individual differences. So this whole thing sets up things that we imagine do have an impact on the way that our bodies respond. So then they go into specific sense organ changes, and this is ocular movement. Basically, it's eye movement, right? And he goes back even further to a study by Jacobson in 1930, and Jacobson found that more ocular movement occurred with imagery when I was vividly imagining something more so than when I was in relaxation, right? So this really highlights that when I'm purposefully thinking about something, then my body begins to engage. My eyes move in the direction that they would typically move. Whereas if I'm just kind of relaxed and thoughts are just kind of flowing freely, I'm not necessarily trying to imagine something, right? So there's also, what this kind of highlights is there's a level of purposeness, right? Or there's a high level of purpose. When I'm being purposeful, then these sense organ changes occur with greater frequency, right? And then what they did is they also kind of tested this with what they called text instruction, right? So in essence, I'm reading you a script, or I'm telling you specific things to imagine. Nowadays, we might call that like guided imagery, right? When text was the instruction or the primary stimulus to imagination, then the evoked image may be patterned on an event. And I think this is one of the things that's really, really important. It may be patterned on an event which occurred remotely in time, which means I might be thinking the way that I'm conjuring up an image is based on my experience from a long time ago, right? A remote time. Or it may even be an original construction of a context never previously experienced. And so we can have these images pop into our mind that come from a long time ago, or that haven't even happened yet. But the text supplies the data with which I need to imagine. And one of the things that I hope you're hearing in this bullet especially is the connection to solution-focused brief therapy and the idea of the history of the outcome and the preferred future. Or as we've started talking about it, Elliot and I, we've started talking about it, this idea of transformation. So it would be and I've started really talking about this idea as far as an experience of the transformation. So I may have experienced the transformation in a remote time, way back in the history, right? Or I may experience the transformation sometime in the future. And what's really cool is way back even in 1930,
I didn't find it.
They started understanding that we could conjure up images from way back or way in the future. And I think this lends some credibility to what's going on in solution-focused work, is that as we ask more and more detailed questions about this transformation experience, the image becomes more and more clear. And the sense organs, you can start to see people's eyes move and think, and oftentimes they're looking up into the sky, typically, kind of at an angle. Um, those are sense organ changes that tell you there is a strong image, there's a vivid image going on inside of this person's head. And that can come from way in the past, or it could even be an image that they've never in person experienced before. So I think there's something really, really powerful about this connection. And then that last bullet is the pattern of somatic activity during instructed imagery is strongly influenced by what the subject is told. So when I tell someone specific things, their somatic experience, right, those sense organs or their muscle tension or those kinds of things, it's really impacted by what I tell them. And this, I think, this puts that imagery really into the power of the person giving instruction. And so obviously we as solution-focused brief therapists, we're going to hold on to this a little bit differently and say, we're co-constructing, right? But I can induce some of this somatic activity by asking really specific questions. When did you first notice this happening? Or what feeling would you notice being there in that place when this occurred? What would you be most likely to eat on a day when this miracle had occurred, right? The more specific we can make these, make our questions, it's almost like we are instructing the client to create a very strong image. And so one of the things I really want you to take away from this is that language used purposefully is really about how change occurs, right? And we'll talk more about that as we go along here. But this article was specifically about emotional imagery, right? And they talk about emotional imagery connected to somatovisceral action. So it's interesting because then they started doing these studies where they would induce different kinds of experiences. They would they would describe or explain or have someone view a dangerous experience or something that would induce fear, right? And they would contrast this with something that was kind of a neutral experience, right? Of walking into your bedroom, right? And so dangerous imaginations led to somatovisceral arousal, right? My heart rate would go up. My respiration would start to speed up. I would take shallower breaths rather than deep breaths. And then also there would be less skin resistance. So oftentimes when we're flushed with emotion, then our skin starts to conduct heat quite a lot, right? Because our heart is racing, and that's a way for our body to get rid of that energy, that increased energy from respiration and heart rate, is that our core temperature goes up, and so our skin begins to conduct heat really well, right? Heart rate and fear ratings were parallel in visualization vividness. That was kind of the hypothesis. They said people who are really good visualizers, their heart rate will go up. Their heart rate will go up in correspondence to how much they are afraid. And one of the things that they've discovered is that this isn't always the case, that heart rate and fear don't necessarily correspond with one another when it's connected to visualization. If I'm a good visualizer, we would hypothesize that my heart rate will go up and my fear rate will go up. But that isn't often the case. I might be a really good visualizer and therefore my heart rate goes up, but I might report I wasn't actually that afraid. And so I think there's a lesson here for solution-focused brief therapists as well, which is we don't want to infuse meaning upon body language, right? Where here we are talking about like muscle tension and all of those kinds of things. And there's a risk that we could start to say, oh, they're getting aroused physiologically, their heart rate's going up, they're starting to have muscle tension. And then I might infuse meaning on what that means. But I think this point here is what they are experiencing physiologically may be different than what their emotional experience is. So we cannot take for granted and start reading into body language and say, oh, they must be really visualizing what's happening. Change is really happening here. So we really need to be careful with what's happening. So then they talked about processing the image, right? So images are not represented in the brain in iconic or analog form, right? So what this means is if I'm looking at, let's say, a lamp, the way that I store that information in my brain, it's not that I have a miniature image of a lamp in my head, right? But it's a network of things that are connected to various concepts, right? It's connected to light. It's connected, let's say my lamp is made of metal, right? So things that are made of metal are connected to that. Things that sit on top of a desk, right? So I have all of these connections, and it's these connections that help me to understand I'm looking at a lamp. It's not that I hold a small image of a lamp in my head. And they get to then this concept that I think is really important, and it's propositions. And propositions are logical relationships between concepts, right? So concept one, things that sit on a desk. Concept two, things that provide light. The proposition is a logical relationship is something that gives light and sits on a desk must be a lamp, right? So these propositions are logical relationships that bridge concepts. In 1973, I really like this definition of an image. It's an internally constructed perceptual description. Think about how we describe solution-focused brief therapy. It's a detailed description of the client's desired outcome. In essence, we are helping our clients to create an image, an internally constructed perception of a description. So what makes an image, right? The idea is an image contains modality-specific information, sense organ adjustments, body orientation or psychological processing, right? So it's all of these, the more details that we can get together, the greater description we have, and the greater the internal constructed perception occurs. So we're really helping our clients to construct an image. And the more clear, the more vivid we can create an image, the more likely it is to create change, which we'll get to in just a little bit. But these propositions, these logical connections, are what help us to create this internal perceptual description. So one of the things that then they shift to is they apply this to CBT or hypnoanalysis or Gestalt therapy. And this is about creating this emotional image. And so although I'm going to talk about it in this realm, I'm also going to then make some connections to solution-focused brief therapy. An emotional image is an elaborate propositional network, right? So again, think about a proposition. It's the logical connections between concepts. An emotional image, something that's creating an emotional response for me, is an elaborate connection of these logical things, right? It includes a stimulus label, right? So black snake, right? We have a concept of snake, we have a concept of black, and then there's a propositional connection. Some snakes are black, right? There's also related semantic information, right? Snakes are dangerous, right? That's that semantic information is how do these concepts relate to each other and what does it mean, right? Are all black snakes dangerous? No, but some are, right? So then I have a perceptual response element, right? So again, this is those sight, sound, smells, physical tension, right? I have a physiological response, and it's connected to this semantic information that I'm getting. If I tense, that tells me something about black snakes. Some black snakes are dangerous. This is a black snake. Perhaps this is a dangerous snake, right? And then the motor program of the affective expression, right? So this is where it becomes behavior, right? If I have that perceptual response, then that should translate to some behavior. I do something. If I'm in front of a black snake and some black snakes are dangerous, my behavior is move away from the snake, right? And this is how CBT is built. This is what CBT is built on. It's this idea of understanding those propositional networks, those automatic thoughts, those faulty beliefs, right? And then it is changing those faulty beliefs so that the behavior changes. Well, solution-focused brief therapy doesn't necessarily go about it in this way, but what we do is through language, we can alter or affect those propositional networks, right? Oftentimes, one of the things that I think is really, really powerful that we can do is when what's the very first thing you would notice? And somebody says, I would experience butterflies in my stomach. One of the really powerful things that we can do to change propositional networks is to say, and what's different about these butterflies that tell you this is because your desired outcome is present, instead of butterflies that are present when you're nervous or scared or anxious, right? So we can help people to language propositional differences. And so we can help people through language change those propositional networks, which then change the perceptual response, right? If all of a sudden I'm experiencing butterflies in my stomach as a positive thing because it's connected to my desired outcome, then my behavior changes. So think about how we as solution-focused brief therapists process text through language, right? And then that last bullet is if they are purposeful about language that is used and the emotional response that is evoked, shouldn't we be as well? So if CBT therapists, if hypnoanalysts, if Gestalt therapists are really, really purposeful about their language and the way that language is used in their propositional networks, we should be even more focused on it because we are a theoretical approach that's based on the importance of language. So I hope one of your takeaways from bio-informational theory is propositions occur in the brain. We can impact those propositions through language, and that will change our perceptions, right? The change in perception means I'm starting to look at something different, and that translates to behavior change. I think it's just as true in solution-focused brief therapy. We just go about that slightly differently by really focusing on desired outcome language. So then they moved into an experimental study where they tested this a lot of different ways. They tested the image cue, right? So this is the instruction of what to imagine. And then they focused on the image orthosis. And this is to aid the image formation. So usually they would show them a film or they would give a verbal script or something like that. And it would include details about what they were supposed to imagine. Now, one of the things in solution-focused brief therapy is we don't necessarily go into it saying, this is what you should imagine. I want you to think about this. But we do go in thinking we're going to describe the desired outcome. And so in some sense, we do go in with a preconceived notion of we're going to create as clear an image as possible of what desired outcome is, right? And then third is the instructions to assume the psychological set of active participation in the imagined event, right? So this is where they will infuse words like, and if that ball came toward you, what would your shoulders be doing? And what would your head be doing, right? And just like they infuse that language to participate with the image, we can infuse language to say, and if your desired outcome, and this is why I think that introducing other people into the description is so important, because now it becomes interactional. Now it becomes active. I'm engaging with this image, and it's creating change, right? And so again, this last bullet point, why would we consider this for a solution-focused perspective? Well, the more clear image, the more participation we can put through language with them and their image, the more likely they are to then go about their world and behave differently. So that's really, really important. Here they talk about the findings when propositions are added to the script that are specific to eye movement or muscle tension or emotional reaction. these things show up more often. So when I infuse things like, and where would you be looking, right? Then all of a sudden they begin looking. And I think this is where solution-focused brief therapy has oftentimes been critiqued by not having an emotional experience or creating an emotional experience or even taking into consideration people's feelings and emotions. And I think this is where we could really be purposeful about this, is infusing emotion and affect and feelings into what our clients are, their descriptions that they're providing, right? What would be the first feeling that you would notice on a day when your preferred future was there? Who would notice that you were feeling happy in this moment? What about your body language would let them know that this happiness is flowing out of you, right? And so we have a real opportunity through these propositions, right? If you started noticing that happy feeling, what would that mean about the presence of your desired outcome, right? We have an opportunity to infuse propositions and emotion into our sessions through this deliberate use of language, right? So we should be selective and we should be purposeful about utilizing words that help the clients to experience pieces of their desired outcomes. As they describe these experiences and they feel these experiences, they'll then begin to experience the change that they're looking for. So images, and one of the findings that they came up with was images control contextual behavior. The more you can imagine it, the more you behave appropriately to your image. So people come in with certain images in their brain, and through talking about the propositions, we can change those images that people have, and therefore their behavior will begin to change, right? So that's kind of in a nutshell, that was like a super fast description of bioinformational theory. But I want to point you into a direction of really current research that's happening by Jasim Kaur and his colleagues in India. And they just published an article not too long ago, within the last couple of years, called Solution-Focused versus Problem-Focused Questions and the Effect of Electrophysiological State and Affective Experiences. They were looking specifically at skin conductance, what they talked about here. And they said, when people experience solution-focused questions, what happens to their skin conductance? When people experience problem-focused questions, what happens to their skin conductance, right? That has direct implications for the images that people are holding in their brains and therefore their behavior that will occur. So although I don't have time to go into this whole study, I would point you in the direction of this article and say, go read it, because this has direct implications, basically a bioinformational theory in a solution-focused realm. Although these authors don't really reference bioinformational theory, there are some really direct correlations and connections here. So I hope that was helpful for you. Thank you for tuning in for this month's Evidence of Greatness, and looking forward to going next month into a third theory that will kind of round out a little bit more why we do what we do. So thanks again, and I'll see you next month.